Like, society is just filled with people who are trying to scam all the time. I want to verify anything anybody ever tells me, because there's people who are trying to extract value in ways that are not positive sum with everyone else. There's people who do have ideological views on AI, and that's been interesting to see play out. People don't want it to replace their job, and so they don't use it to increase their productivity to, keep their job, which is paradoxical. Because there's tremendous volatility due to how much wind and solar have been connected to the grid here. That creates situations where there's a mismatch between the supply and demand of electricity. Why are people buying Bitcoin from Bitcoin miners? It's because governments are providing a bad money. And then it's like, well, why is the Federal Reserve creating a bad money? Well, because of the legislative process by which the Federal Reserve was created.
This podcast is entertainment, not financial, tax, or legal advice. Views expressed represent statements of the speaker in their individual capacity, do not represent the views of Unchained, and should not be considered investment advice. Speakers often have personal, family, or business connections to Unchained, which may include direct financial benefits. Please see our disclosure at unchained.com/podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Bitcoin Frontier podcast. This week we have on Pierre Rochard from Riot. Pierre, welcome.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. One of the resources that I personally dove into when I first got into Bitcoin was the Nakamoto Institute. I know many people on the Unchained team did as well. What is the Nakamoto Institute? And you were a co-founder of it, right?
I'd say Michael Goldstein really was the founder, and everyone came after that. And he's the president of the institute. And so it really is about looking at kind of the origin story of Bitcoin and placing it in kind of the wider context, but also just adding more thoughts to the story as it has unfolded over the past decade.
So when you guys first started posting different various articles and posts on it, what were your thoughts about it? I mean, it was so early in Bitcoin's days. Like, was it very serious content where you're like, oh, this, we're going to end the Fed, like this is the future of the world reserve currency? Or are you like, man, this would be cool, let's write about it, maybe it will work out, maybe it won't? Like, were you guys extremely confident way back then?
I think that, so first of all, when we got really interested in it, we felt like we were late, right? That, oh man, the OGs are from like 2010, 2011, and we're like the latecomers to this story. And I think that part of it was just kind of trying to bring together a lot of disparate information. And I think that we probably still feel that way today, right? You'll hear people say, oh, it's like, what's really hard about learning about Bitcoin is that like the content is all over the place, and you have to, sift through a lot of different content to find kind of the like Bitcoin ethos in its totality. So I think that nothing has changed in that regard. If anything, Nakamoto Institute is just like added like one more thing that people have to like do a deep dive on the rabbit hole. But so were we confident? Yeah, I think that, if I look at where my interest was really in terms of actually putting pen to paper, one was that I'd read a paper by Peter Serta that was very good. It was an Austrian economics analysis of Bitcoin and why the regression theorem of money is not a blocker to Bitcoin becoming, a money. So I read that. I read as well there was a paper that was about speculative attacks, and basically the IMF needed to get its hands on Bitcoin, and build up a reserve before anything bad were to happen. I didn't think that its causal mechanism for how that works was fully fleshed out. And that's why I wanted to write my own version of it, essentially, to kind of answer the key question, which is this idea of a tipping point. Like, people think that, okay, once Bitcoin gets to a certain percentage of adoption, then there's a rapid acceleration, an S-curve, phase transition, rather than having kind of a slow-going process of just people basically adopting Bitcoin really as digital gold, right? As kind of a a parallel, but ultimately not a substitute for the dollar. I think that was like the, and it still is, I think, probably the average view among people who are interested in Bitcoin is still that, hey, look, like it's unrealistic to think that this is actually going to replace the dollar. And it's messaging that we have, even in public policy contexts of like, oh, you guys don't need to worry about Bitcoin replacing, the dollar as a global reserve currency. So, don't attack it too much, which, yeah, that's great positioning. But I don't think it's necessarily backed by the economics of it long term. The other part of it, though, I think that now with kind of many years buried between those predictions of Bitcoin replacing the US dollar and that not having happened, now there's just skepticism towards like that thesis, right? That people are like promoting stable coins as the future of money, and that Bitcoin's just going to continue to be a niche interest. So I definitely think that the debate is still open. Uh, the kind of the dollar coexistence camp has never been stronger, just because Bitcoin and the dollar have coexisted now for 14 years. Um, but I still think that, what's not falsifiable about the tipping point position is that it's just like, well, at some point in the future, right? There's not a way of like saying like, hey, look, after the next halving, like it's the final bull market and this is where it's going to finally happen. Um, I, I think that would be too aggressive of a position to have. But I still think that, yeah, it's in the future. And so it's not like what I wrote back then is something that I would forsake or be like, hey, look, I was wrong about that. Not yet.
Yeah, no, it's definitely very fair. I mean, Speculative Attack was one of my favorite posts on the Nakamoto Institute. I guess this might be more of a like timing question, but we Michael Saylor, I guess, got really into big into Bitcoin back in 2020. Why do you think more people haven't followed in his footsteps as like borrowing dollars and trying to buy a bunch of Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I think that it's really about how much capital can Bitcoin absorb. And so this is what I think makes a monetary technology like Bitcoin have a different adoption pattern than a non-monetary technology. And really what I would call a commodity technology. It's funny because we talk about Bitcoin being a commodity. It's really not, right? It's a scarcity. It's what makes it a money. But that a commodity technology, you quickly go from the 0 to 1 to the 1 to n. And the 1 to n is kind of the wider distribution of, okay, hey, if we're going to have computers, we're going to quickly ramp up manufacturing of computers so that within a couple of decades, your computer is in the same format as a phone, right? That the technology has been fully commoditized and is cheaper and wider in its distribution. So with a monetary technology like Bitcoin with a scarcity, that doesn't work. So meaning that as Bitcoin adoption happens, Bitcoin miners don't produce more Bitcoin and scale up. Okay, we were at 50 Bitcoin last week per block. Now we got to get to 100 Bitcoin per week because we're just getting lots of people demanding Bitcoin. And so we've got to get it to a wide distribution, right? That's not how it works. Instead, it distributes through the price mechanism of, hey, the value of the Bitcoin, its purchasing power has to scale, has to increase in order to accommodate for this increase in demand for people who want to hold value in Bitcoin. And that creates a bottleneck because then you have the speculative people trading Bitcoin layered on top of that, the leverage layered on top of that, and then also the rebalancing layered on top of that. That is that with iPhones, you could imagine the absurd scenario of, hey, somebody bought 5 iPhones and now they're rebalancing their portfolio because the value of iPhones has increased, and it has increased from $1,000 per iPhone to $5,000 per iPhone. And so now the secondary market is like having to distribute iPhones rather than Apple, right? Rather than new iPhones on the primary market. So it causes these cycles, and especially because you then have like the social mania aspect of it, that everyone's talking about Bitcoin at the same time, everybody's trying to onboard at the same time, and the bottleneck is not transactional capacity at the base layer, which often gets pointed to. The bottleneck is really how much can Bitcoin's price ramp up before there's so much sell pressure from the secondary market of people rebalancing, right? And then on top of that, all the derivatives and the leverage trading and all of that. And even just without the leverage, just the traders who are momentum traders. You don't have momentum traders in iPhones who are like building up inventory because they think the price of iPhones is going to go up next quarter. Like that doesn't exist. And so that means that Bitcoin's adoption happens very differently than the adoption of other technologies. You get these wild oscillations in price that then in the bear market, that drives new adoption away. And I do think there's still like a certain amount of adoption that happens during the bear market, despite the price action, that you have what I'd call like real fundamental adoption of people who are adopting Bitcoin for its utility, either as savings or as payments, but that they're not just momentum traders, right? Obviously, since those guys are selling in the bear market. So I forget where we started with the question, but that's why I think that there's a different path here.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely pretty safe to say we've never seen, the monetization of a new commodity at this pace, if that's what we're seeing, which I think we are. Whenever you, back in 2013, originally in 2014 and so on, published a lot of these posts on the Nakamoto Institute, did you think it would happen faster than it has happened over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. Because in the Speculative Attack article specifically, I lay out that this is going to happen whenever you have enough liquidity at the exchanges, between fiat and Bitcoin. And I think the benchmark I set for liquidity was like in the hundreds of millions. Now we're in the billions, right? In the tens of billions sometimes of trading volume. Um, and so clearly I was wrong in terms of what threshold this is going to happen at. I think that yeah, Bitcoin's got to be bigger before it has kind of that critical mass. Or I'm wrong in that it doesn't reach that critical mass, regardless of how big it gets. It's still the kind of the causal mechanism that would cause it to replace the dollar will still fail, right? I think is kind of the other theory. But the other part of it too is that is Bitcoin going to replace the dollar through kind of an upgrade process, or does it, in an emergency, because the dollar has destroyed itself, that Bitcoin has to fill a vacuum? And I think that that is still TBD. Just based on what's going on with kind of the dollar system right now, it doesn't look great.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. So you've been on the Bitcoin frontier for, I guess, a decade now. I'm pretty sure you started your career as an accountant. Did being an accountant like enable you to think about Bitcoin from like a different perspective?
You know, I started my career at Target, folding clothing. And that actually did influence me in one regard, which is that I one day I was in the parking lot of Target and these guys pulled up and they were running what's called a white van speaker scam. And they were like, "Hey, we have these speakers here. We were going to install them. They canceled the contract. Do you want to buy them half off?" And they're like completely overpriced, right? So it's half off from like $5,000 to $2,500, but they're really worth like $30, right? And these white van speaker scams, like they're, I thought it was just like a weird, like, what are you guys talking about? Like, I'm here to fold laundry. But I thought it was really interesting that like society is just filled with people who are trying to scam all the time. And it did make me think that like I want to verify anything anybody ever tells me, because the world is not like, it's an adversarial environment, right? There's people who are trying to extract value in ways that are not positive sum with everyone else. And so I think that that already kind of tainted my view of altcoins, in the sense of I'm just going to be very skeptical about any claims, but even of Bitcoin, right? When I first started learning about Bitcoin, it was like my instinct was that the cryptography could not be bulletproof. And so somebody saying the cryptography is perfect or whatever, like, that doesn't make sense to me, and that means Bitcoin's vulnerable in some way. It took me a long time to get to a point where I was like, okay, the the assumptions here are, pretty reasonable. Um, so then, working in accounting, I think that same level of skepticism. I mean, this is probably why I ended up in audit, right? It's like I was interested in like running the numbers and double checking things, just on a almost reptilian level. But um, that then I thought it was just fascinating that like other accountants weren't immediately interested in sound money, because they didn't understand like monetary economics from an Austrian perspective. They had a Keynesian perspective of it, right? And to them, it was like, okay, well, this is uninteresting, because how do you have an elastic money supply that can, stabilize the economy? Um, so, uh, yeah, I think that that's also perhaps a break on Bitcoin adoption versus other technologies. Like, there's people who do have ideological views on AI, and that's been interesting to see play out. Of like, people don't want it to replace their job, and so they don't use it to increase their productivity to keep their job, which is paradoxical. But also at a policy level, people think that like AI is going to destroy the world, and it's basically a nuclear weapon that if there's a lab leak, that somehow it's going to become gray goo and consume the world. Um, but the, so I do think that like a lot of technologies get pushback, but that Bitcoin has gotten more pushback than any other technology on just purely ideological grounds, not on, hey, is this actually useful to me or not? That's something that I saw throughout my career. And then yeah, kind of moved from accounting to software engineering, then to product management at Kraken. And now to research here at Riot.
Yeah, I like it. I know about your being a product manager at Kraken. What made you shift from accounting to product management?
Yeah, so it really was a switch from accounting to software development, because I really felt like there was a lot of manual data entry in accounting, and that didn't make sense to me in today's world of computers. And so that's why I got into software development, to like automate that. And then from software development into product management, of basically that um, there is a gap between the business world and the software engineering world, and that bridging that gap can be very valuable in a lot of different contexts. So that kind of drove my interest in the world of product management.
Yeah, makes sense. On like at your time at Kraken as a product manager and being a software engineer in general, how has that shaped your views on building Bitcoin products? Like I feel like a lot of Bitcoin and even like crypto companies, they like, go through phases where they blow up and do really good, and then they die and disappear, and you never hear from them again. How do you think about building actual Bitcoin products?
Yeah, so I think that I've become increasingly conservative in this regard, of basically that you have to first of all have a very limited scope of what you want to do. I think that the companies that kind of overstretch themselves and like expand their scope to um, to as they're trying to basically growth hack, right? That they're trying to get more users, and so they build more and more features rather than kind of just staying super focused on the area that they want to excel at, and kind of accepting the growth rate of that, and growing organically with it, which um, might not lend itself sometimes to like being aligned with VCs or other stakeholders who like want that like very consistent rapid rate of growth, which I think is really about as we were talking about, other technologies where that is sustainable. And whereas in Bitcoin, companies get themselves in trouble because they have this very fast growth during the bull market, and then they get a big slowdown in growth, and they think it's because of what the company is or is not doing, rather than the fact that you got to ride the waves in Bitcoin, and that sometimes, there's going to be times where, hey, you hunker down, you build during the bear market, but you're not really like uh, building in the sense of growing headcount and like rapidly expanding and trying to bring in more users, but rather just, hey, iterating on the existing product, fixing bugs so that addressing scaling bottlenecks that were identified during the ramp up, and that way you're ready for the next bull market, rather than like trying to find ways to have growth in the bear market. I think that that's probably something that I've noticed over the years.
I definitely agree with that. Would you say that's basically just adopting a lower time preference and, being able to survive the dark winters that come with Bitcoin adoption?
Yeah, I mean, look, like Bitcoin's volatile, right? That's like the number one critique of it. And so the risk management and the business planning has to be very sensitive to that and be ready to pivot, pretty quickly. And so that comes with the other part of it too, though, I think, is that um, people in the crypto world will invest lots in building on something that is a fad and that is gone in the next bull market, right? And so I think that's where I'm like, okay, here's why you should focus on Bitcoin. This is what's going to be here in the next 5 cycles, right? You can't tell me with a straight face that any other technology is going to be here through the next 5 cycles.
Completely agree. Like the Bitcoin community, I feel like has been wrong about a number of things throughout the years, including myself. I'm sure you have as well. Is there anything that you think that the community is like mainly wrong about today?
Mainly wrong about. I think that, gosh, that's a hard question.
And maybe it could
Yeah,
be like, may not be, you might have a different opinion from the rest of the community on this. So it
yeah. I
could
mean, I
be,
think that it's really around this. It's still around what we wrote about with the security budget, but uh, specifically the block size limit. I do think the block size limit is going to be increased in the future, and I think like the community is mainly wrong about that being, uh, you know, uh, unrealistic. But I also, I don't think it's the end of the world if it doesn't increase. I just think that from a not from a normative perspective of it should be increased. I think from a predictive perspective, the odds that it will be increased are higher than what the community is handicapping it at.
fair enough. That's a definitely a good take.
And just to back that up with like why I think that's the case is it's about improvements in internet connectivity and hardware. Like that the internet is going to get faster, hardware is going to get faster, and the software is going to be increasingly efficient in terms of verifying the blockchain. And so that means that the like median cost of running a Bitcoin node is going to tend to go downwards, and that's going to justify an increase. Yeah,
Yeah, fair enough. I guess you're still saying that that would be like decades or more
sure.
away
Yeah,
from now.
yeah,
Yeah. I know since you are at Riot, we can talk about mining. New York Times and others have talked about how Bitcoin mining emits a lot of CO2. You made a very famous video fact checking the New York Times and explaining that Bitcoin ASICs do not visit or emit CO2. I've visited multiple Bitcoin mines as well, and I can confirm that that's the case. What do you like? What are your general thoughts? Like, why are why is the mainstream media overreacting to Bitcoin emitting CO2 and mining in general?
yeah. I mean, I think that it's the angle they have on energy intensity, as they put it. That is that this is a process that is consuming, gigawatts of electricity. Um, I think that, the latest estimates are still less than 10 gigawatts. I'd have to double, fact check me on that. But um, so, or yeah, probably like between 15 and 10 gigawatts, which is a lot from, one perspective, but from another, it's not a lot. And it really comes down to the question of who is this energy intensity competing with? Because if it's just competing with waste, that is, that this energy would have gone to waste, then it doesn't really provide a solid angle from kind of a populist, like uh, zero sum perspective, where they're like, hey, if you're taking electricity, that means that there's a hospital that doesn't have electricity, and it's, there's a blackout, and that, these patients at the hospital are dying. Like, I think that's what that, I'm using an extreme example there of, what they're complaining about is with energy intensity, but that if that's absent, then they have to find other indirect arguments relating to energy intensity. So the indirect argument is about carbon emissions. That is, that there's some sources of electricity that do emit CO2, and that if the greenhouse gases are causing this runaway climate change that is going to cost lots of lives and, cost lots of resources, then we have to, one is change power generation, right? So adopt nuclear, adopt wind, solar, battery, hydro. And then they talk about renewables, like burning down forests apparently is renewable as biomass, which I don't know about that one, guys. But anyway, some lobbyist there was able to get that in there. But the other argument that they have is that we have to reduce overall energy consumption, electricity consumption, so that we don't have to build as much electricity generation. And that's one perspective on it. I kind of have just a market driven approach of, okay, look, if people are willing to buy electricity, then for example, a homeowner, they have to choose between increasing the energy efficiency of their house to lower their electricity consumption, or just paying more for electricity. And I think that is a decision that people can make without any intervention of, trying to decide that trade-off. And so I think that from a kind of a policy perspective, that also applies to Bitcoin mining. That is, that if people who are holding Bitcoin, who are, essentially running nodes and setting the rules for Bitcoin, if they want to pay the miners for these Bitcoin, and then that indirectly causes the electricity consumption, and that indirectly causes the power generation, and that indirectly causes carbon emissions because there's a policy failure in terms of pricing that externality, then it just seems very odd to kind of circumscribe the causal mechanism and say, actually, the causality, because we could also go in the opposite direction of, why are people buying Bitcoin from Bitcoin miners? It's because governments are providing a bad money. And so really the indirect carbon emissions are coming from the Federal Reserve, right? If we want to kind of draw the full causal mechanism, and then it's like, well, why is the Federal Reserve creating a bad money? Well, because of the legislative process by which the Federal Reserve was created. And so it's, okay, it's the legislators. Who voted for them? The voters. Okay, so it's the voters' fault that there are these carbon emissions, right? And so then for the New York Times to then come out and say, hey, look, here's the causal chain. It starts with Bitcoin miners. That's because that's where they want it to start, not because there's a legitimate, coherent argument that that's where it starts. They want it to start there because they don't like Bitcoin. And so any kind of negative story is going to start with, okay, where does the Bitcoin nexus, where does it intersect with Bitcoin? Because then everything downstream of that is bad. And it's also the case, it's not just about the carbon emissions, right? They'll run headlines about terrorist financing is coming from Bitcoin, when really what we're talking about is like a very small dollar value of terrorist financing relative to other sources, right? Whether it's billions of dollars going, through Iran, or lots of weapons that were left behind in Afghanistan, where you know, it would be interesting for some senators to say, hey, look, what's the indirect causal mechanisms here, right? Is Bitcoin, to me, it's totally bizarre to be like, hey, Bitcoin is why there's terrorism in the world, when terrorism existed long before Bitcoin. In fact, I would argue that there have been fewer terrorist attacks since Bitcoin was invented in 2008 than before. Um, just as an empirical question of, okay, what's the causality here? Um, so it doesn't matter to them whether the substance is true of, is Bitcoin disproportionately contributing to carbon emissions or disproportionately contributing to terrorist financing. What matters to them is, what are the different hooks we can use to try to ban or limit Bitcoin, because we want to protect the seigniorage revenues that we have from issuing the world reserve currency, is really, I think, the correct framing to look at these debates as.
Yeah, those were fantastic points. Very good. Another question that I have relating to mining is, obviously you're working for Riot Platforms, a $1 billion publicly traded Bitcoin mining company. This can be answered from your perspective or Riot's perspective or whoever.
This is all from my perspective.
Okay.
This does not reflect the views of Riot. To the extent that they don't. Yeah, to the extent that they do, they do.
Fair enough. Well, what is your perspective for Bitcoin miners out in the world surrounding the block reward being cut in half? I worked at Block where, a lot of miners are definitely getting ready for the halving, upgrading their machines and trying to drive down their electricity expenses. How do you think about, that from a Bitcoin miner's perspective?
Yeah, so our Bitcoin mining strategy is to have the lowest cost of production through a combination of vertical integration and then the electricity power strategy. And so from the vertical integration perspective, it's really about being a real estate company. So having that land, being a construction company that builds the data centers, operating the data centers, and having the self-mining within that, owning the machines, right, and contributing hash rate. So that's also in conjunction with ESS Metron that does the electrical equipment manufacturing. So that is part of getting to a very low cost of production, because when we start talking about the halving, it really is a game of musical chairs, right? That, okay, we had 6.25 chairs. Now we have 3.125 chairs. And that means that 50% of the people are going to sit on their butts on the ground. Whereas, the other shareholders are going to continue in the game. So whoever has the lowest cost of production gets a chair. And that's really the way to think about it. And so from our perspective, because we are very competitive on having the lowest cost of production, that we get to continue. And we're going to continue on that strategy, so that continues to be the case, for going forward. The other piece of it is the power strategy, right? So this is really critical in the ERCOT market, in the Texas market, because there's tremendous volatility due to how much wind and solar have been connected to the grid here. Because of federal subsidies in, it's called the production tax credit, there is a massive amount of historical deployment of wind and solar and also of new deployment going forward. And that creates situations where there's a mismatch between the supply and demand of electricity. And so that mismatch has to be bridged by really three different kinds of technologies. One is natural gas peaker plants that are able to, so they use basically jet engines, right? These are aeroderivatives that are able to go from 0 to 100% electrical output in a matter of minutes, right? And those peaker plants are part of making kind of um, uh, bringing enough generation online to match increased demand. If wind and solar are underproducing, either because it's night and there's no solar, um, or there's no wind, or some combination of both. So the other technology is batteries. Batteries are very expensive. So in practice, peaker plants really, are the bulk of what balances the grid. The third technology is demand response. And demand response can happen at the residential level. So you can sign up with your utility and they will control your thermostat and change what temperature it is in your house to reduce your demand during peak load times. And typically they'll pay you like $50 to do that for a whole year or something like that, right? Um, and that's at the residential level. It also happens at the industrial level. And so at the industrial level, which is the level where Bitcoin miners like Riot are operating, that's where we are directly contributing to grid balancing, both through economic demand response of, hey, look, our strike price, let's call it $100 a megawatt. Anything above that, we economically curtail. But also by participating in ancillary services with ERCOT, so that the grid operator has control over how the load behaves in relation to what's going on the rest of the grid, so that they're able to, in real time, balance supply and demand and provide for their role, their mandate of maximizing reliability on the grid. So for Bitcoin miners, in terms of having kind of a power strategy that is adapted to the Texas environment, it's a combination of having a power purchase agreement in place, a hedge in order to be able to pre-purchase electricity when prices are low and there's ample generation, and then being able to sell that pre-purchased electricity when there are constraints, when there's not enough power generation because there's not enough wind or not enough sun, that we as a load are able to sell our electricity back to the market, and that allows for a balancing of supply and demand. And so combining that with participating in ancillary services is really what makes a power strategy that reduces the cost of production for mining a Bitcoin to be really competitive on a global basis.
Yeah, it definitely seems like Riot has one of the best power strategies in the entire industry. I think you hammered out like the cost side of things, but I think from like an outsider's perspective, they may be like, why would I, want to allocate capital to a business where I know for sure their future revenues, at least denominated in Bitcoin, are going to go down forever? How would you argue that? Would you basically just say like, hey, those 3 Bitcoin are going to be a lot more valuable than these 6 Bitcoin that we're earning today? Or how would you take it?
Well, I think it still has to do with the cost, because you're right that it's a revenue thing, but the way to frame the revenue conversation as a cost conversation is that you're doubling the cost of production with the halving. And so if your cost of production was $10,000 per Bitcoin before the halving, then it's going to be $20,000 per Bitcoin after the halving. Then you can still look at it from a unit economics perspective and say, hey, look, this still makes sense. And on top of that, if your competition does not have that same cost structure and they have a bad cost structure that puts them above, where basically if their cost of production is $40,000 per Bitcoin after the halving, then they go out of business. Then you take their market share, then your revenue perspective is not minus 50%, right? It might be minus 20% because there's also been a reduction in terms of hash rate and difficulty due to others not being, not having the right unit economics post-halving.
Fair. Another question kind of relating to the halving or just halvings in general is bringing back up like stock to flow not just the model, but like the concept in general of like, I guess, scarcity or flow relative to supply or stock. How do you think about stock to flow? Like, was the model completely wrong? Is the concept completely wrong, or is the concept right? How do you reconcile those two, and how do you think about it today?
Yeah, great question. So, this is probably still something that, as we were talking about the block size limit, that I'm at odds with the Bitcoin community on. I think that because Bitcoin didn't go to $100,000, that NGU and stock to flow and all of this, like, people are really upset about it. So they're like, hey, look, this model is broken because, the price did not go up enough. Um, and I just think that it shows the limits of the model and of really the heuristic. I mean, putting the math aside, just kind of the thought process of uh, supply versus demand. And I think that the reason why we did not go up higher in the previous bull market is actually because of inflation. And this is very counterintuitive because people are like, hey, look, Bitcoin's an inflation hedge. So if inflation is running hot, that means Bitcoin's going to outperform. But if inflation's running hot and that causes rates to increase and that causes dollar supply to decrease, then Bitcoin's going to underperform. And so it really is like a game of chess of how far into the chess game are we looking at in terms of Bitcoin's price, reflexivity. And so I think that's what happened is that Bitcoin underperformed because we went into a tightening cycle because inflation was hot, which is, counter to the narrative of Bitcoin being an inflation hedge. I think that Bitcoin's really a monetary hedge, and that if the monetary cycle is negative, then Bitcoin's going to underperform. Um, so then it's like, okay, well, that is outside, that's exogenous to Bitcoin's stock to flow, to the Bitcoin's supply, right? Software engineering perspective. And that's right. So I think that it has to be the intersection between Bitcoin's monetary policy, Bitcoin's supply, S2F, and the dollar's monetary policy of interest rates, right? And that intersection is, I think, a big part of Bitcoin's price action. Now, we can get into debates about like relative merits and like quantifying it and all that, but um, that's where I'd stake out the position. Now, the other thing that I've really noticed, from the Bitcoin mining industry, is that people tend to look at what is the flow impact of Bitcoin miners selling into the spot market as they're earning Bitcoin, right? And I think that is valid, but you also have to add on top of that that that's just the OpEx piece of the cash flow statement. Add the CapEx and uh, kind of the investment, right, of the investment and financing part of the cash flows in order to get a more fulsome picture of how much is Bitcoin mining impacting price action. Because look, Core Scientific, they liquidated how many Bitcoin because of their balance sheet, financing situation. Or, Bitcoin miners choosing not to buy Bitcoin or accumulate Bitcoin and to buy machines instead because of where the hash price is, right? So I think that, like, in terms of understanding what the price impact is on, or what Bitcoin mining and the relationship with price is, I think that there's more that could be modeled into that so that it's clearer that, hey, look, there's an investment cycle in Bitcoin mining infrastructure that is like 12 to 24 months. And we have to take that into account when we think about, okay, does the halving impact Bitcoin price action? Because there's complicated flows as part of that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's a lot more complicated than people make it out to be. And it is kind of funny what you brought up earlier about the dollar, I guess like M2 supply actually decreasing. The dollar became ultrasound faster than ETH, I guess, in that case. But last question, then we can go ahead and wrap it up. What excites you like about humanity other than Bitcoin? Is there any other topic or interest that you have right now?
Yeah, so I've been using AI quite a lot, ChatGPT. I think that it is it is a huge productivity booster, and that we're only scratching the surface of how much it's going to improve things for humanity. And it's very fascinating because it does intersect with Bitcoin mining in the sense that now we have two um, two highly valuable things competing for the same set of scarce resources. And so AI data centers and Bitcoin miners are now, going to be kind of competing with each other pretty directly. And I love both. And so I wish this was not the situation, but the reality is there's only so many transformers to go around. There's only so many, hundreds of megawatts to go around. And in the short term, in the medium and long term, right, humanity can do anything. But in the short term, I think we're going to start seeing articles, of Microsoft saying, "Hey, Bitcoin mining is controlled by the Chinese, and we need to get rid of it." That's kind of competitive angles.
Yeah, it is pretty funny that like the Bitcoin mining industry kind of went down and then all of a sudden the AI industry went up, and maybe at some point they'll be both going up together and it'll be even crazier than it was before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the next bull market's going to be bonkers because I do think that AI is going to continue to grow at a breakneck speed, and that, there will be another Bitcoin bull market, and that coincidence will be pretty fascinating to be a participant and spectator on.
Completely agree. Pierre, thanks so much for coming on. This was an awesome podcast. Where can the audience go find and learn more about you after this?
Yeah, Twitter at Bitcoin Pierre. Watch out for those impersonators, and on LinkedIn, Pierre Rochard. Thanks for listening in.
Awesome.
And thanks for having me on, Joe.
Yeah, of course.